The tragic reign of Charles I, a descent into civil war and execution. The story of Charles I, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, is one of the most tumultuous and tragic chapters in British history. His reign, marked by political strife, religious conflict, and a fatal inability to compromise, culminated in a devastating civil war, his own execution, and the temporary overthrow of the monarchy. Charles I's rule was a study in absolutist ambition clashing with the growing demands for constitutional governance, and his legacy is a dark reminder of the perils of unchecked power and the fragility of political stability. Now, before we move on, please help a small channel grow. Please like and subscribe. If you have any comments, good or bad, leave them below. Back to the story. The rise of Charles I, a king ill-suited for his time. Charles I ascended to the throne in 1625, inheriting a kingdom already rife with tension. The son of James I, the first Stuart King of England, Charles was a man of refined tastes, deeply committed to the divine right of kings, and profoundly lacking in the political acumen necessary to navigate the complexities of his era. Unlike his father, who had managed to maintain a precarious balance between the crown and parliament, Charles was inflexible, autocratic, and unwilling to concede to the growing demands for shared power. From the outset, Charles's reign was plagued by controversy. His marriage to Henrietta Maria, a Catholic French princess, aroused suspicion among his predominantly Protestant subjects. This union, coupled with his perceived sympathy for Catholic practices, fueled fears that Charles sought to undermine the Protestant Reformation and restore Catholicism to England. These suspicions were exacerbated by his reliance on advisors like the Duke of Buckingham, whose influence and policies were widely unpopular. Charles's early conflicts with Parliament set the stage for the crises that would define his reign. His need for funds to wage wars against Spain and France led him to repeatedly summon and dissolve Parliament, as MPs refused to grant him taxes without concessions. Charles resorted to controversial measures, such as forced loans and the imprisonment of those who refused to pay, further alienating the political elite. His authoritarian approach sowed the seeds of distrust and resistance, creating a rift between the Crown and Parliament that would prove irreparable. The reign of personal rule, a kingdom on the brink. Frustrated by Parliament's refusal to comply with his demands, Charles embarked on a period of personal rule from 1629 to 1640, known as the 11 Years' Tyranny. During this time, he governed without Parliament, relying on prerogative courts and dubious financial expedients to maintain his authority. He imposed taxes like ship money, traditionally levied only in times of war, across the entire kingdom, provoking widespread outrage. This period also saw the rise of Archbishop William Laud, whose efforts to impose uniformity in worship and suppress Puritan dissent further inflamed religious tensions. Charles's personal rule was characterized by a profound disconnect from the realities of his subjects' grievances. His belief in the divine right of kings blinded him to the growing demands for accountability and reform. While he saw himself as a benevolent ruler, his subjects viewed him as a tyrant, trampling on their rights and liberties. The king's inability to recognize the limits of his power and the changing political landscape of his kingdom would prove to be his undoing. The breaking point came in 1637, when Charles attempted to impose the Anglican Book of Common Prayer on Presbyterian Scotland. The Scots rebelled, and the ensuing bishops' wars forced Charles to recall Parliament in 1640 to secure funding for his military campaigns. The Long Parliament, as it came to be known, was dominated by figures like John Pym and Oliver Cromwell, who were determined to curb the king's authority. They passed a series of reforms, including the abolition of prerogative courts and the requirement that Parliament be summoned at least once every 3 years. Charles, however, remained defiant, and his attempts to arrest 5 MPs in January 1642 marked the final rupture between the Crown and Parliament. The descent into civil war, a kingdom divided. The English Civil War, which began in 1642, was a conflict born of deep ideological and political divisions. On one side were the Royalists, or Cavaliers, who supported the king and his vision of absolute monarchy. On the other were the parliamentarians, or Roundheads, who sought to limit the king's power and establish a constitutional government. The war was not merely a struggle for political supremacy but also a clash of worldviews, pitting tradition against reform, and authoritarianism against democracy. Charles's leadership during the war was marked by indecision and a lack of strategic vision. While he enjoyed early victories, his inability to capitalize on them and his reluctance to negotiate in good faith prolonged the conflict. The king's intransigence and his refusal to accept any compromise alienated potential allies and hardened the resolve of his enemies. The war devastated the kingdom, claiming the lives of an estimated 200,000 people and leaving entire regions in ruins. The turning point came in 1645, when the parliamentarians, reorganized under the new model army led by Oliver Cromwell, decisively defeated the royalists at the Battle of Naseby. Charles's forces were decimated, and he was forced to surrender to the Scots in 1646. Despite his defeat, Charles continued to scheme and plot, hoping to exploit divisions among his enemies. His duplicity and refusal to accept the new political reality only deepened the mistrust and animosity toward him. The trial and execution of a king, a revolutionary act in 1648, following a second civil war sparked by Charles's attempts to regain power, the parliamentarians, now dominated by the army and its radical elements, took the unprecedented step of putting the king on trial. The trial of Charles I was a revolutionary act, a direct challenge to the centuries-old belief in the divine right of kings. Charged with high treason and tyranny, Charles refused to recognize the authority of the court, declaring, "I stand more for the liberty of my people than any here that come to be my pretended judges." Despite his defiance, Charles was found guilty and sentenced to death. On January 30, 1649, he was led to the scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. His final words, a testament to his unwavering belief in his divine right to rule, were, "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be." With a single stroke of the axe, the executioner severed Charles's head from his body, marking the end of his reign and the beginning of a new era in British history. The legacy of Charles I, a cautionary tale execution of Charles I sent shockwaves across Europe, challenging the very foundations of monarchy and paving the way for the establishment of the Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell. Charles's reign and its violent end serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolutism, the importance of political compromise, and the consequences of failing to adapt to changing times. Charles I was a man out of step with his era, a king who clung to outdated notions of royal prerogative in the face of growing demands for accountability and reform. His reign exposed the fragility of political systems and the catastrophic consequences of unchecked power. While his execution was a radical and controversial act, it underscored the enduring struggle for liberty and the rule of law. In the end, Charles I's story is one of tragedy and hubris, a reminder that even the most powerful rulers are not immune to the forces of history. His reign, marked by conflict and bloodshed, left an indelible mark on the British Isles, shaping the course of its political and constitutional development for centuries to come. The legacy of Charles I is a dark and complex one, a testament to the enduring tension between authority and liberty, and the high cost of failing to reconcile the two. Please like and subscribe.